time to recap, but first I need a recap. We're going to talk about what happened in the first test run of this season of beta testing for the testing of my Savage Worlds campaign setting. Brief recap before we get going on the recap is that Savage Worlds is a roleplay game system that is tabletop, traditional, dice and paper based, which is set up to be really easy for dungeon masters and game masters to sort of run with, and for everyone to spend more time sort of in the actual gameplay than in sort of the metagame or the creation of characters and the statting of things and that kind of stuff. It's more about sort of enjoying in the moment, and it's very roleplay heavy. My campaign, just so that we're all on the same page with this real quick, is a science fiction setting that's very much something between Borderlands, the video game series, and Firefly, the television series. It's very much like Borderlands in that it's a frontier world, and everyone who's living there is living there very precariously in a situation that's very dangerous and very deadly. And it's very much like Firefly in the context that there are a lot of highly high-tech science fiction elements, but from a day-to-day perspective, everyone's tech level is tied to their socioeconomic standing. And so a lot of characters are carrying around things like revolvers and what we consider more mundane modern-day types of stuff, and it's because it's just more utilitarian, cheaper, and makes more sense rather than carrying around laser guns. It's not to say there aren't laser guns, but most characters tend not to carry them around. So in the last few videos, I was discussing what kinds of weapons and items and character classes we were going to go with, and how everything was still kind of up in the air what to do about this. This is a world where sort of we develop the bestiary first, or all the monsters and the actual like planet where this is taking place on, and then we're kind of making all the characters to test the monsters, and sort of the idea is the bestiary or the world book is going to be published separate from the sort of player character campaign setting. And the reason why I want to do that is I want to create something that is kind of genreless. So if you're doing like a high fantasy setting, you could, in theory, have them teleported to this planet, and because all the monsters and everything on it aren't specifically themed as science fiction, it could easily be a misadventure for a lot of different genres of game. Because I noticed that a lot of tabletop role-play game systems just in general don't have sort of, I don't know what to call it, but just sort of settings to temporarily drop characters into, or locations to travel through that aren't like, I don't know what to call it, but rooted heavily in some giant overarching campaign that you either have to commit to or not use at all. So all of that long-windedness aside, what we ended up going with was basically 3 to 4 classes. We have a ranger, we have a scavenger type, and we have a face. And then we kind of have a marine mercenary archetype. And these fill the basic roles of like the mercenaries, the heavy weapon dealer dude guy, and then the ranger is really heavy on being a tracker and being able to search, and basically is like an animal expert type of character. And then we have the scavenger, whose specialty is basically in D20 what you might call as a tinkerer, a character who collects items and then makes things out of those items. And the face is the face. Face is a term that a lot of roleplay games use in just describing a character who does all of the charisma-related activities, the spoony bard, if you will. And so there's that guy, and we're going to flesh all these out way more and make them way more specific, but those are sort of the ones we went with. And so the first game started off with a very simple premise, and it was that everyone who was playing the game had recently immigrated to this planet of lawlessness and frontiersiness there is only one settlement on the entire planet. It's that dangerous, and it was a very accidental sort of occurrence. Nobody really meant to colonize this world. It's more like a penal colony spaceship crash landed and the surviving prisoners just kind of set up camp. And lo and behold, they're alive. So they've set up this kind of lawless Mos Eisley type environment where people go there because they know that they're safe there no matter what they've done anywhere else. And I've spent 5 minutes explaining the entire campaign setting, but basically everyone's a new immigrant and everyone has been picked out by the head guy, the head dictator king character. It's very much a dictatorship. Basically the biggest mob boss, drug dealer character who survived the initial crash just kind of sat on top of the heap of everyone else and said, well, I basically know how to arrange drug rings so I can run a government, right? He gives the character players a job to go out into the wilderness and to pick up basically what accounts for a group of people who are trying to smuggle illegal goods onto the planet's surface without permission or knowing. Because since this is a dictatorship-run community, the rule of the king dictator is basically that whatever comes through onto his world, he gets first picks. His, I guess what you could call some kind of an import tax of whatever he deems he gets to keep, and then you keep the remaining. And so somebody was greedy and tried to get around this, or didn't want him to know what they had, and so tried to land without anyone noticing. And lo and behold, they crashed, and their ship got destroyed and obliterated, probably looked like a shooting star through the sky, and now they are sitting humiliated in the middle of the wilderness waiting to be rescued before all the carnivorous monsters devour them all. Probably some of them were devoured already. So everyone gets in a vehicle, and this is another thing that's going to be a topic of wanting more input from you guys, is that vehicles are going to be an important element in the setting, but vehicles should not be so overcomplicated that like it takes you 10,000 years to pick what you're going to drive. Excuse me. So I'm curious if you had to like break down vehicles maybe into 3 main types or something, in terms of all these vehicles should most likely transport a few people. It should be able to carry a cargo of some kind, and most of all it has to be durable. Partially that's why it would be able to carry cargo and people, is, you know, you're talking about something much bigger than a motorcycle, you know, something that sits a few. So far we basically have statted out what you would call like a basic military World War II Jeep, more or less. It's a hover vehicle, and the reason for that is so things can't entangle the wheels and trap it. As long as it's in hover mode, things cannot, you know, sort of clamp around it. It's able to escape much quicker. In the future, I'm thinking of maybe creating a half tread. That's a vehicle with like tank treads, but like wheels on the front, so it only has half treads, and those look really cool. But that's another video entirely that I went on too long ago. So they go out to meet these guys, and the first thing that happens is while they're in the woods, they get jumped by the equivalent of a giant gorilla rhinoceros monster who has the ability to hop around like a kangaroo. And they kill this. This was my big failing of the session. They killed this thing way too easily. I did not stat it correctly, and it went down hard. One of my big problems was that I hadn't really accounted for what, I guess, how high-end some of the rifles can be in the basic selection of the player's manual for Savage Worlds, and it kind of got one-shotted, meaning the player had crit it. If it was not a crit, it would not have killed the monster, but he was just a little too lucky, and I hadn't planned it out very well if somebody was able to crit with a weapon with high enough damage, that kind of thing, and it went down. So that was a really underwhelming encounter. So they killed it. It crashed sort of on the hood of their vehicle, and the bodies sort of hung out there until they were eventually able to sort of scrape it, or kind of fell under the hover vehicle, which singed under the mechanism under there and was left on the forest floor. So that was kind of disappointing. They were happy, of course. Players love winning against things and not dying, but of course the game master is always mildly disappointed when things, don't absolutely terrify and torture everyone. So they leave the forest and they hit a field, and this is a world where there are lots of different, what you would kind of see from like a Minecraft perspective, biomes or different terrain types that sort of bump right up against each other. So they exit a forest and they enter a grassy field area and come up to the crash, which is a typical crash. You got your big long trough of sad earth that's been churned up, and then at the very end is a smoldering heap of bleh. And this is where the face element comes in, and immediately this is where this setting becomes evident in how it's like a little bit different. Even though there's going to be a heavy emphasis on it being like a frontier world and there's a lot of monsters and the environment has to be combated a lot for the most part. It's mostly you against the environment. I guess that's PvE in a sense, from a MMO standpoint, a player versus environment kind of thing. But the one element from like a character building standpoint or a flavor standpoint is that everyone on this world has to be a criminal. That's a requirement of mine as the game master, is that when players make characters, something had to have happened in the character's life that was so awful that they've really run out of options of where else to go. And so they've ended up on this kind of Mos Eisley outlaw planet because they have limited options. Now, they don't have to be an outright criminal. They don't have to be like a thief or a murderer, but they did something that technically breaks the law, that's ruined their reputation, that's totally destroyed all other options. So they end up here. A good example of this is one of the player characters is an engineer who used to manage all of the life support systems of a dome environment on the moon. Yes, our moon. And what happened was that he developed a severe drug problem to the point that one day he basically killed everyone in the dome by accident. He was just so out of it that he missed a minor error, and the minor error expanded exponentially, and everyone died, and it was clearly his fault. And he's never going to be able to get a job anywhere, and he's guilt-ridden, so he's become more of a drug addict. So he's ended up on this planet because he's just kind of run out of places to be. Nobody really wants him around. He's kind of a washed-up failure. So in that circumstance, the character could, on like the D20 alignment scale, be called sort of neutral in a lot of senses. He's not evil. He didn't mean to hurt people, but he did. And so he's ended up there. There are other characters who have secretly been serial killers or other awful things, and they're obviously much more on the evil end of the spectrum. So getting back to what actually happened on the adventure, we have the characters arriving to rescue the survivors of the crash who is trying to smuggle in stuff. 3 guys are left, and we gave them generic names as sort of a joke, like one's like Tom and like Phil and Bob, I think. Bob was severely injured. It was evident right off the bat because the hull of the ship was still pretty much intact, so like when they got out of the vehicle they were sort of looking up at everyone sitting on top of the hull of the ship. And Bob clearly was not standing or sitting. He was like sort of splayed lying on the ship, and you could just see his boots hanging off the side. And clearly Bob was not doing well. And then Tim, or Tom, and Phil were pretty okay. I think Phil's arm was broken. And so Phil and Tom get off the side of the ship to talk to the face. And then I think it was the scavenger. Yeah, we had 2 scavengers in this session, and one of the scavengers got to deal with Bob. No, wait, no, I'm sorry. I'm having like a spoony Countermonkey moment. It wasn't the scavenger, it was the Marine. Yes, the mercenary, Marine guy. Went to go attend Bob, because the reasoning is like, if you're a gun for hire, you probably know basic first aid. So he's dealing with the really sick one. The face goes to talk to the other 2 guys. The other 2 guys immediately exhibit signs of shadiness. Something is up. And they begin to immediately start to hint that they have some kind of ulterior plan, and that they're kind of trying to feel out the face character in terms of where the party will go in terms of, should they invite them in on this or not, or whatnot. And after some long sort of staring between me and the other player and some careful dialogue, what the face was able to find out was that even though they had crashed, they had been found out, all the stuff, the King Dictator wants everything taken back to the hub and, probably locked up in a vault or something. Excuse me. They offer basically a financial incentive to the players that if they were to load up the cargo that's still intact onto the Jeep, and if they were to, before they go back to the hub, to the one town, if they were to take a detour to the far end of the plane and like over and around some area and whatnot, there's a camp of people just kind of hanging out there. And if you were to just drop off the cargo, that would be cool. Not all of it, but some of it, enough that we could keep some in secret for ourselves, and then the rest of it goes to the King Dictator, and he keeps or does whatever he does with the amount that he sees, not knowing that more had existed. And the face decides no. And the no was a very interesting no, because the way the player explained it was, I know that it would be pretty cool to have whatever in those boxes as payment. A lot of the game is, there isn't really a lot of currency being exchanged. I'm trying to keep it more towards a barter system. And I know that seems a little complicated, but I'm trying to cut down on the amount of shopping hell that sometimes exists with tabletop games, where people spend way too much time looking through books, through inventory lists, trying to decide what they want to buy with their money. Instead, I want to give the players objects or quantities of objects. They can either then maybe trade for a short list of things, or they'll just use those things. They'll just have those things in their inventory. And that's how we're trying to work for now. So they would get some share of the amount that they bring over to this other camp. But the face said no, and he said the reason why was that he could identify that the King Dictator is a total slime ball. And what's important right now for them as a group is to build up enough trust with the Scumlord so that in the future they can pull shit. That was his direct words, that he has no intention of being actually just straight up loyal to this guy, that he wants to impress the King Dictator enough early on that they can start pulling stuff behind his back later. And I thought that was a great idea. That's something that I really liked, the idea that this game was invoking that in the player base, that they wanted to become slimy and manipulative because the NPCs around them are slimy and manipulative. So they were kind of sad, but they were like, okay, whatever. Because what are they going to do? They're wounded, they're stranded, they can't really fight, they're already found out, they're kind of screwed. They could throw out the offer, but that was the most that they can do. That was their last ace up their sleeve. And if that doesn't work, they have to just go and face the consequences. So they load up in the car, and Bob is not going to get in the car with them because the mercenary slit Bob's throat. And the reason why is that the mercenary rolled really bad on the whole trying to help stabilize Bob thing. And so instead of letting Bob bleed out, and instead of trying to re-roll repeatedly and probably not do very well, he just slit Bob's throat. He said, Bob was suffering. He probably wasn't going to make it much longer. Fix it for him. And I thought that was, again, an interesting scenario, trying to lead the players into this world of gray, of shades, and trying to encourage the players not to be bad guys, but to think in terms of a more sort of selfish survival aspect and not worry about trying to maintain the appearance of being the hero. They're just kind of out for themselves. And if they can make friends along the way, that will probably help, but it's not a goal. So Tom and Phil jump in and they sit in the car, and they are actually purposely lined up to be on either side, far sides of the vehicle. They're sitting next to what would be the door or the window. And then the player characters are seated in the middle with one player character in the front. And there was an NPC driving, because in Savage Worlds there is a driving stat and you have to make rolls to drive. But we wanted to make sure that this first adventure people couldn't flip the car and destroy everything. We wanted to kind of make sure that the adventure sort of went through its different phases, its different acts, Act 1, Act 2, Act 3, and then ended back at the hub. Even if people died in the middle, we wanted to at least make sure that the party succeeded in surviving somewhat and making it back. So there was an NPC driver. And there's some hint that she may be in on it, but it's not clear. She's a human, and she's a cyborg. She has a giant modem sticking out of her head. She sort of has a bob cut on one side of her head, and then she has shaved the other side of her head, and there is literally a computer modem, an old-fashioned dial-up kind of looking modem device sticking out of her head. It's not a dial-up modem, but it looks very similar, with little lights blinking and things like that. Very crudely stuffed partially into her brain. And she seems like she was in on it, but she seems cool with the party's decision. She doesn't want her head cut off anyways either, so she's just gonna go along. Okay, we're going straight home. Screw the guys at the camp, whatever. And they go home. And I was kind of iffy about making an encounter on the way home, and it turned out, in the end, I decided not to do it because of timing reasons with how long the session was going. We have a limit of maybe 4 or 5 hours to do this whole session, so I figured with the amount of time that was spent negotiating and things like that, we had to kind of wrap it up. So they get back. Well, wait, no, they don't get back. They go through the forest. And then the way it's set up is that the one town is basically a walled-off fortress bumped up against the coastline. So then the idea is that because it's bumped up against the ocean, more or less, things cannot, come up from behind, that everything has to approach from the front through the front gates. And right ahead of that gate is a large sprawl of about maybe 2 miles of just sort of mowed down, cut down, flat area so that they can see out that far in front of them before the dense forest sort of builds up over it. So the vehicle comes through the forest and comes in line of sight of the town. And at that point, the players make a decision I wasn't expecting. The face suddenly turns around to look at the scavenger and the mercenary, and he says, "Do it." And they throw out Tom, or Tim, and Phil. They literally shove them out the sides of the vehicle. This is basically a convertible, meaning it's a topless vehicle. It has no roof, so it's like a roofless Jeep. And they shove them out the sides. Nobody's wearing a seatbelt, so they just shove them out. And Tom and Phil are both injured from the crash, so they fall out and roll. And then the face makes the announcement, and the other two laugh and nod along with him that, well, they might end up screwing us later. We'll dump them out now, and there's enough ferocious monsters, they'll probably never make it back to town, and it probably looks good if one of the lookouts saw through a binocular lens that we ditched them. I don't know if I should be proud of this behavior or horrified at this behavior, because I know these guys, I know these players, and I was kind of surprised that they got this into it. I played this game once before with a group of people about a year ago, and a lot of them were very iffy on the whole sort of outlaw concept, and this group was absolutely fine with it. So they roll into town, and immediately everything is confiscated. They basically get nothing, except the king dictator says they can have 2 guns. And when he says guns, what it is they opened up the crate, and there are high-powered laser rifles that have obviously been stolen from some government agency off-world, and that they're probably freaking illegal to begin with, and then they're being brought down here. And as far as anyone knows, nobody has lasers. Now they get 2 lasers. Now, there are 4 party members, so that's kind of a problem. It means the party gets 2 laser guns, even though there are 4 people. So it means the party's going to have to divvy up and decide who's allowed to handle the laser rifles, and who has to put up with 6-shoot revolvers. But that's for another time. That was where the story ended, and everything turned out okay, and they maintained the trust of the king dictator for now. Because, as the face said before, it's just to make him comfortable. So that's what happened with the session. And I'm going to continue making a little vlog thing, and it runs kind of long, but I'll continue making it of each session, just to give you a feel of what's going on, and I'll be giving more details as time goes on about this setting. It's a little vague, I know. Sorry I'm not getting into horrible, grotesque levels of detail, but a lot of it is that things are still kind of up in the air. Don't want to announce anything too official and then have to recant it later, but that's how it's going. So thank you for watching. Your patience is adorable and much appreciated. Have a nice day. Bye.